Isolated by a fierce snowstorm, veteran Jack Callahan believed nature was his greatest adversary. He was mistaken. Within the confines of the cabin, his usually placid service dog, Ghost, exhibited peculiar behavior. His agitation wasn't directed at the storm, but rather a fixation on the stone fireplace, marked by scratching and whining with an uncharacteristic intensity. Jack recognized the signal instantly. This was not apprehension, but a warning. What could lie concealed beneath solid stone that only his canine companion could perceive? A secret concealed for 15 years. He understood he must place his trust in his sole companion and expose a truth someone was prepared to kill to keep hidden. We request your support by subscribing to the channel. The atmosphere in the Flathead County Courthouse Annex was heavy, carrying the scent of aged paper, damp woolen overcoats, and the subtle acrid notes of tepid coffee. It was the aroma of bureaucracy, a smell Jack Callahan had earnestly hoped to leave behind permanently. He occupied a seat on a stiff wooden bench near the rear, an isolated figure amidst a gathering of local residents and shrewd investors. His posture was erect, a bearing ingrained through 2 decades of service in the United States Army, yet his gaze drifted, fixed upon the rain-streaked window rather than the auctioneer at the front. At his feet, resting with a quiet dignity that seemed remarkably out of place, was Ghost. The dog, a German shepherd, possessed a coloration that consistently elicited inquiries. Instead of the conventional black and tan, Ghost's dense double coat displayed a striking blend of silver, gray, and pale cream, a wolf-like shade of sable that had softened and lightened with age. At 9 years old, he had retired from a life of service that Jack rarely discussed. His muzzle was flecked with white, and the amber depths of his intelligent eyes conveyed a profound, knowing tranquility. He was more than a dog. He was an anchor, the silent guardian of Jack's peace. Jack himself was a man chiseled from a similar mold of quiet resilience. In his late 40s, he stood tall and lean, possessing a strength that was more wiry than substantial. His short, practical haircut was streaked with silver at the temples. His face bore the imprints of his life. Lines of concentration etched around kind blue eyes, and a faint pale scar bisecting his left eyebrow. A memento from a long-forgotten firefight in a place he preferred to forget. He was clad in what had become his civilian uniform, a simple gray t-shirt beneath a worn but clean plaid flannel shirt, faded blue jeans, and sturdy work boots. He sought not comfort, but utility, not conversation, but solitude. The auctioneer, a stout man with a monotonous voice, proceeded through the list of foreclosed properties and seized assets with practiced regularity. A 2015 pickup truck, a set of woodworking tools, a small bungalow on the outskirts of town. For each item, a flurry of hands would ascend, a brief competitive display that Jack disregarded. He awaited a single item, a phantom entry on the county ledger he had discovered weeks prior. "All right, next up," the auctioneer announced with a sigh, adjusting his spectacles. "We have parcel 7B, locally recognized as the Old Miller Place." A palpable shift occurred within the room. Not a sound, but a sensation. A collective indrawn breath, a sudden hush. The low murmur of hushed conversations evaporated. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice now completely devoid of its already minimal enthusiasm. The property encompasses 160 acres, a single cabin listed in poor condition, one well, status unknown. This property is offered strictly as is, where is. It comes to the county by means of tax delinquency. 15 years of unpaid property taxes. 15 years. The phrase lingered in the heavy air. It represented an immense duration for a parcel of land to remain in a state of limbo. Jack perceived the subtle pivot of attention from the other attendees, their gazes shifting from the auctioneer to him, the sole unfamiliar face. They comprehended his presence. He had inquired about the parcel at the county clerk's office the preceding week. "We'll commence the bidding at 500, or, quote, "1, 500, quote, 2. I have $500 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 6? Quote, "Está 3 going once." Quote, 4 going twice. Quote, 5 sold. Quote, 6 to the gentleman in the back for 500. Quote, 7 doesn't know what he's just bought. The Miller Place, cursed, I tell you. The clerk who processed his transaction, a young woman with anxious eyes, avoided his direct gaze. She slid the deed across the counter as if it were contaminated. The entire encounter left a disagreeable impression, yet did not dissuade him. He had confronted individuals armed with rifles. Whispers and peculiar glances were a form of currency he no longer valued. With the deed to his new existence secured in his pocket, Jack led Ghost out into the crisp Montana air. He required a few essential provisions before venturing to his new property. The sign adorning the town's main thoroughfare read, "Abernathy's General Store," its paint showing signs of wear from decades of harsh winters and bright summers. As he entered, a bell positioned above the door chimed. Inside, the store emanated the aroma of sawdust, leather, and freshly ground coffee. An elderly gentleman stood behind the counter, his face a kindly map of wrinkles. He was the only other person present. "Afternoon," the man greeted, his voice warm. "What can I get for you?" Jack nodded, retrieving a concise list from his pocket. "Just need a few things. A good padlock, some lamp oil, coffee, and a new axe handle, if you have one." As the proprietor collected the items, he regarded Jack with undisguised curiosity. "You're the fellow who just bought the Miller place, aren't you? News travels fast in a town this size." "I am," Jack replied simply. The old man, identified as Abernathy by the name stitched onto his apron, leaned against the counter, his amiable expression shifting to one of seriousness. "Son, I hope you don't mind an old man's meddling, but you should know what you've gotten yourself into." Jack paused, his hand hovering above a bag of coffee beans. He had anticipated this. "I'm listening." "That land," Abernathy began, his voice lowering, "it belonged to a journalist, Arthur Miller. Sharp fellow, moved here from back east about 16 years ago, always asking questions, poking his nose into things. Then one day, he just vanished. His truck was still at the cabin, but he was gone." He let the words settle. Because he had no family here, the property became entangled in all sorts of legal complications with the county. Tax bills accumulated. For over a decade, it was a quagmire nobody could navigate. A curious thing, though, Blackwoods Corporation, the major mining entity, attempted to acquire it several times through some complex legal maneuvers. But they were never successful. County regulations are stringent. If it's a tax foreclosure, it must proceed to public auction. No exceptions. Abernathy wiped the counter with a clean cloth, despite its already immaculate state. "So, it just sat there, and people started talking. They say it's haunted, that Miller's ghost still roams the woods seeking justice. They say the land is inherently unlucky. That's why no one bid against you. They don't perceive a bargain, son. They see a considerable amount of trouble." Jack listened patiently, absorbing every syllable. He paid for his purchases, his movements measured and deliberate. He met the gaze of the old shopkeeper, whose eyes conveyed genuine concern. "I appreciate the warning, sir," Jack stated, his voice sincere. "I truly do." He turned and exited the store, Ghost trotting silently beside him. The bell chimed his departure. On the street, the sky was beginning to clear. Jack looked down the long, deserted road that would ultimately lead him to his new abode, haunted, cursed, entangled with a missing journalist and an influential corporation. For another man, this might have been a catalyst to retreat. For Jack Callahan, a man who had journeyed to Montana seeking nothing more than tranquility, it felt remarkably like he was finally progressing in the correct direction. He had acquired more than just land. He had obtained a purpose. The drive away from town was a gradual shedding of civilization. Jack's aging 1998 pickup truck, its engine a familiar and reliable rumble, left the paved streets behind. The road transitioned to gravel, pelting small stones against the undercarriage, and then, precisely as indicated on the county map, it deteriorated into a dirt track that was little more than 2 deep ruts carved into the earth. The expansive Montana wilderness unfolded around them, a breathtaking panorama of rolling hills that yielded to the jagged blue silhouettes of distant mountains. This was the quiet he had been seeking. Ghost occupied the passenger seat, his head held high, his nose twitching as he processed the novel, sensory landscape flooding in through the partially open window. He was an exemplary traveler, composed and observant. His presence fostered a silent dialogue that filled the truck's cab. They located the property's turnoff, marked only by 2 decaying fence posts, the wire between them long since rusted away. The entrance appeared to be a simple product of neglect, But as Jack meticulously picked his way along the overgrown track, his senses, honed to detect the out-of-place, began to register discrepancies. The downed fence suggested an unhindered welcome. Paradoxically, a substantial pine tree lay across the path, necessitating a sharp and challenging detour. Despite appearing weathered and aged, its placement struck Jack as almost artfully arranged, an intentional impediment. 100 yards further on, a dense growth of thorny bushes encroached from one side, forcing the truck perilously close to a steep drop. It felt less like untamed wilderness and more like a meticulously crafted obstacle course, designed to deter the casual explorer. After an additional 10 minutes of cautious driving, the trail opened into a modest clearing, and there it stood, the cabin. It was smaller than anticipated, constructed from thick, dark timbers, with joints filled with now crumbling gray mortar. A broad porch sagged on one side, and the windows presented as dark, opaque squares coated in grime. Moss adorned the stone chimney that ascended from the steeply pitched roof. The structure exuded weariness, a forgotten artifact succumbing to nature's persistent encroachment. Jack silenced the engine, and the profound quiet that ensued was broken only by the gentle sigh of the wind through the towering pines encircling the clearing. He and Ghost disembarked from the truck. The atmosphere was crisp and clean, fragrant with pine needles and moist earth. Quote, Jack stated softly, his voice likely the first human sound to break the stillness in a considerable time. Quote 1. Ghost responded with a low woof, his tail maintaining a slow, consistent sway. He remained close to Jack's leg as they advanced towards the cabin. The porch creaked under Jack's weight, but the primary timbers felt robust. The front door was unlocked. A gentle push caused it to swing inward on protesting hinges, revealing a single, spacious room shrouded in dimness. Sunlight valiantly penetrated the grimy windows, illuminating airborne dust motes suspended in the still air. The interior carried the scent of cold ashes, mice, and the deep, earthy aroma of decaying timber. A plain wooden table accompanied by 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Against the far wall stood a cast-iron bed frame, stripped bare to its springs. Dominating the left wall was the fireplace, a grand construction of river stones reaching the ceiling. It presented a picture of utter abandonment, save for a few minor details that felt strikingly incongruous. Upon the simple wooden table rested a ceramic coffee mug encircled by a faded blue band. Adjacent to it, a book lay open face down, its pages slightly warped as though its reader had merely stepped away momentarily. On a hook near the door, a heavy wool coat remained hanging, one pocket subtly distended. These were remnants of an interrupted existence. One does not flee in haste, abandoning a coat in the midst of a Montana autumn. One does not vanish permanently, leaving a book awaiting completion. Jack's hand swept across the dusty table, a profound sense of melancholy enveloping him. He was not merely in an unoccupied dwelling. He had arrived at a location still resonating with the echo of an individual, Arthur Miller, the journalist who pursued too many inquiries. While Jack was lost in contemplation, Ghost began to exhibit unusual behavior. He had been conducting his own silent survey of the cabin, sniffing at the corners and the cold bed frame with calm curiosity. Now, however, he stood motionless in the center of the room, his entire form rigid. His gaze was fixed exclusively on the stone fireplace. A low whimper, indicative of deep disquiet, rumbled in his chest. His ears lay flat against his skull, and his hackles rose slightly along his spine. Quote, Jack inquired, his voice hushed. Ghost paid him no mind. He took a few deliberate steps closer to the hearth, his nose working with intensity, sampling the crevices between the large, flat stones forming its base. He exhibited no aggression or vocalization beyond a whine. This was different. It represented a profound, instinctual disturbance, a canine sixth sense signaling that something was fundamentally amiss with that section of the room. Jack had witnessed this reaction only twice before. Both instances occurred in a war zone, and on both occasions, Ghost's unease had preceded the discovery of something dangerous and concealed. Jack knelt beside his dog, laying a reassuring hand on his back. Ghost's muscles were taut. Jack placed more trust in the dog's instincts than in his own visual perceptions. He regarded the fireplace, perceiving nothing beyond cold stone and residual soot. Yet, Ghost perceived or sensed something more. As the afternoon sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting hues of orange and purple across the sky, Jack stood on the sagging front porch, the new padlock now secured to the door. He had resolved to spend the initial night in the truck, allowing time to air out the structure. Leaning against a post, the fragments of the enigma began to coalesce in his mind. The auction where locals treated the property title as if it were a death sentence. The narratives Abernathy had shared, a deliberately crafted myth of a haunting. The subtle, almost professional obstacles on the trail, engineered to render access just difficult enough. And now, Ghost's unwavering, anxious focus on the hearth. It was all excessively deliberate. This was not a location haunted by a spirit. This was a place shielded by a narrative. The rumors, the isolation, the neglect. It all served as a bulwark, a form of camouflage cultivated over years to repel visitors, ensuring no one would scrutinize it too closely. Arthur Miller had not simply disappeared. He had left something behind, something sufficiently significant that, for 15 years, influential individuals had perpetuated a falsehood to keep it concealed. And now, that fabrication had been compromised. Ghost came to settle at his feet, pressing against his leg. He looked up at Jack, his amber eyes seeming to hold the weight of the cabin's cryptic history. He remained unsettled, yet his place was here, with his human. Jack gazed out at the vast, darkening wilderness. He had sought solitude here, an escape from the specters of his own past. Instead, he had acquired someone else's, and for the first time in a considerable period, he felt a burgeoning sense of purpose extending beyond his own survival. Jack awakened to a world rendered in shades of gray. The oppressive steel-cold sky pressed down upon the landscape, and the wind, which had been a mere whisper the previous day, now roared with a desolate, ravenous voice. He sat up in the driver's seat of his truck, the wool blanket he'd used for warmth offering little defense against the pervasive chill. The initial snowflakes, as large and heavy as wet ash, spiraled down from the clouds. This was not the gentle snowfall of a picture postcard winter, but the vanguard of a blizzard, an early-season storm descending with ferocious intensity. Ghost, who had been slumbering in the passenger seat, was already awake and alert, his ears pricked as he attuned to the rising fury of the wind. "Looks like the world decided to shut its doors on us, boy," Jack murmured, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Staying in the truck was no longer a viable option. The cabin, despite its dust and decay, provided solid walls against the impending tempest. They dedicated the subsequent hour to relocating essentials from the truck to the house: a heavy-duty sleeping bag, a crate of non-perishable food, the tools he had recently acquired, and a substantial container of fresh water. Each excursion was a struggle against the intensifying wind, the snow now driving down in a dense, blinding curtain that reduced the world to a disorienting swirl of white. Within, the cabin felt like a tomb, yet it served as a sanctuary from the storm's onslaught. Jack's primary concern was a fire. He meticulously examined the fireplace, the very one that had so agitated Ghost the preceding day. The flue was unobstructed, and the stone structure, despite its age, was sound. He kindled a small, cautious fire, and soon a welcome warmth began to counteract the cabin's deep chill. The firelight flickered across the log walls, casting dynamic, distorted shadows that appeared to possess their own volition. However, the warmth did little to assuage Ghost's distress. As the fire grew, so did the dog's anxiety. He refused to settle on the blanket Jack had provided. Instead, he commenced pacing, the soft clicking of his claws on the wooden floorboards punctuating the silence. His circuit remained constant, a tight, agitated loop before the stone hearth. A low, persistent whine vibrated in his chest. Quote 2. Jack stated, attempting to soothe him. He reached out and stroked Ghost's back, but the dog's muscles remained coiled with tension. Ghost obeyed the reassuring touch for a moment, pressing against Jack's leg, but his amber eyes never strayed from the base of the fireplace. He then pulled away and resumed his vigil. This time, his agitation intensified. He lowered his head and began to paw at the large flat stones of the hearth, his claws scraping ineffectually against the unyielding surface. He emitted a short, frustrated bark, a sound that was sharp and insistent. "Ghost, stop!" Jack's voice was firm, but the dog only barked again, glancing back at Jack with an expression conveying desperate urgency. Jack sighed, his own apprehension mounting. This transcended mere anxiety. He had spent years learning to interpret this dog, to comprehend the subtle language conveyed through his posture, his breathing, the twitch of his ears. This was the same intensity Ghost had displayed when he located a concealed cache of weapons buried beneath a dirt floor in Kandahar province in 2009. It was a signal. It was a call to action. Trust your partner. It was the paramount rule of survival, and Ghost was the most dependable partner he had ever known. The storm raged outside, enveloping them in a world of roaring wind and snow. Jack stood up, his decision made. He would heed his dog's instincts. He retrieved a lantern and ignited it, its steady golden illumination providing clearer light than the flickering fire. Quote, he said to Ghost. Quote 1. Ghost appeared to comprehend immediately. He ceased barking and sniffed intently at one specific stone at the base of the hearth, precisely in the center. It was a large rectangular slab of slate, its surface smoother than the rounded river stones that comprised the remainder of the structure. Jack knelt, running his gloved hands over the surface. Initially, it appeared identical to the others, set firmly in place. But upon examining the edges, he noticed what Ghost's superior senses had already discerned. The mortar within the groove surrounding this particular stone was distinct. It was not the same crumbling, sandy mixture as the rest. It was darker, possessing a slightly rubbery texture, and in some areas, it had been artfully concealed with a layer of dirt. This was a seal, not a bond. He retrieved his utility knife and carefully scraped at the edge. The blade penetrated slightly. It was pitch, hardened over time, yet still distinguishable from the solid mortar. This stone was intended for removal. It served as a door disguised as a floor. The keystone, a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, coursed through him. His heart pounded against his ribs. "Good boy, Ghost," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Removing the stone was another matter. It was heavy and set perfectly flush. He returned to his pile of supplies and retrieved the crowbar, its steel cold and substantial in his hands. He inserted the flat end of the bar into the seam he had scraped clean and applied his weight. For a moment, nothing yielded. He readjusted, gaining better leverage, his muscles straining against the unyielding stone. Then, with a low groan, the seal began to break. He worked the crowbar around the edges, chipping away at the hardened pitch. Finally, with a loud, grating screech that set Jack's teeth on edge, one side of the stone lifted a few inches. He dropped the crowbar and gripped the edge with his fingers, pulling with all his might. The slab was immensely heavy, but it shifted, sliding from its position onto the wooden floor with a heavy thud that vibrated through the cabin. Ghost fell silent, his pacing ceased. He stood beside Jack, peering down into the dark, rectangular opening that had been revealed. Jack held the lantern over the opening. Below was not earth, but a small, man-made cavity approximately 4 ft deep and lined with stone. It was a shrewdly constructed cellar, a concealed hiding place, and nestled at the bottom, resting on the dry ground, were 2 items. One was a heavy dark green metal box, the kind utilized by the military for storing ammunition or sensitive documents. The other was a neat stack of leather-bound notebooks, tied together with a faded piece of twine. He looked from the hidden cache to his dog. Ghost was now composed, his tail giving a slow, satisfied wag. The source of his frantic, persistent call had finally been discovered. Jack took a deep breath, the frigid air filling his lungs, and prepared to descend into the darkness. The storm was a living entity, a wild beast hurling itself against the cabin's thin log walls. Jack hauled the last of his essential gear inside before the snow became too deep, then bolted the door, shutting out the roaring chaos. The world contracted to the 4 walls of this room, and the flickering circle of firelight cast by the hearth. Ghost remained close, his earlier anxiety regarding the fireplace replaced by a watchful calm now that the secret had been uncovered. Jack placed the heavy metal box and the stack of notebooks on the simple wooden table. He handled the journals with reverence for the man who had penned them. They were bound in dark, supple leather, the pages filled with a neat, dense script. He poured himself a mug of black coffee from the percolator he'd set on the hearth's edge. The bitter aroma offered a small comfort against the cabin's chill. He then opened the first notebook, dated 2008. The words of Arthur Miller unfolded across the page, recounting the story of a man who had journeyed to Montana seeking the same thing Jack had: quiet truth. The early entries comprised observations of the natural world, but the tone soon shifted. Miller began to document his investigation into the GeoCorp Mining Company, detailing their questionable land acquisition practices and rumors of environmental shortcuts. Subsequently, the entries turned personal. Miller wrote of the mounting pressure. It commenced subtly. A county inspector arrived unannounced, citing a complaint about his septic system for which no record existed. He was issued a fine. A few weeks later, another inspector claimed his chimney was not up to code, despite it having stood for 50 years. Then came the boundary disputes, official-looking documents suddenly appearing that seemed to diminish his land holdings. Miller's neat script grew slightly more agitated as he wrote. They are endeavoring to drain me dry, to overwhelm me with fines and legal paperwork. This is not arbitrary harassment. It is a choreographed campaign to compel me off my own land. They desire this place, but not sufficiently to compensate for it. Candidly, they aim to seize it to create the appearance that I abandoned it beneath a mountain of debt and violations. It is a more discreet, cleaner method of obtaining their objective. However, I will not yield. Jack read for what felt like hours, a profound respect for the long-deceased journalist growing within him. Miller had been a fighter. He had recognized the web being woven around him and had refused to be ensnared. The notebooks were not merely a diary. They constituted a meticulous account of a war waged not with bullets, but with bureaucracy. He was so engrossed that he failed to hear the approaching vehicle. Ghost did. A low growl, akin to distant thunder, vibrated from the dog's chest. He rose from his spot by the fire, every muscle taut, his gaze fixed on the cabin door. Quote, Jack whispered, immediately alert. Ghost's growl deepened, and then Jack heard it. A faint struggling sound beneath the wind's howl, the grinding whine of an engine battling its way through deep snow. No one should be out in this. No one ventured this far down a forgotten trail during a blizzard for a friendly visit. Swiftly Jack gathered the notebooks in the metal box and returned them to the hidden cellar, sliding the heavy stone slab most of the way back into place, leaving just enough of a gap to retrieve it later. He scattered some dirt and ash over the seam to conceal it. By the time he stood up, the engine's sound was much closer. It stopped directly in front of the cabin. Jack moved to the grimy window, rubbing a small circle clear with his sleeve. A heavy-duty county-issued SUV, its emergency lights off, sat idling in the swirling snow. A large figure emerged from the driver's side. A moment later, a heavy fist pounded on the door. Jack took a steadying breath, schooling his features into a neutral expression. He placed a hand on Ghost's head, a silent command for the dog to remain quiet but ready. Ghost complied, the growl subsiding into a tense, watchful silence. Jack unbolted the door and opened it a few inches. The man standing on his porch was large and formidable, broad-shouldered and thickly built in his sheriff's department winter coat. He appeared to be in his mid-50s. His face was weathered and ruddy from the cold, with a thick mustache obscuring his upper lip. However, his eyes, small and dark, commanded Jack's attention. They were cold, flat, and devoid of any genuine warmth. They scanned the interior of the cabin over Jack's shoulder. It was Sheriff Riggs. Quote, Riggs said, his voice a gravelly baritone that seemed overly loud. Quote 1. The pretext was so flimsy, it was transparent. Quote 2. Jack inquired, his tone level. Quote 3. Riggs offered a dismissive shrug, a practiced, almost political gesture. Quote 4. It was not a request. Jack opened the door wider, and Riggs stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold air with him. He stomped the snow from his boots, his eyes continuously sweeping the room, taking in the meager fire, the sleeping bag, and the sparse supplies. Ghost stood his ground, a silent gray statue of distrust. His body was rigid, his head lowered, and his eyes never left the sheriff. Quote 5. Riggs commented, giving Ghost a wide berth as he moved toward the fire to warm his hands. Quote, Jack replied evenly. Riggs's eyes narrowed momentarily. He turned from the fire. So, finding everything all right out here? Place is in pretty rough shape. Find anything unusual? He was fishing, his casual tone betrayed by the intensity of his gaze. "Nothing but dust and drafts," Jack stated, leaning against the doorframe. "It's what I paid for." Riggs chuckled, a hollow sound. "Yeah, I suppose you did. You know, this place has been a thorn in the county's side for over a decade due to those back taxes. A real headache. I'm surprised anyone was foolish enough to buy it." The words, laden with condescension, landed precisely as intended. It was an affirmation, a subtle boast, and a test all at once. He was confirming the narrative the shopkeeper had shared, letting Jack know he was part of the system that had controlled this land for years. "One man's foolishness is another's peace and quiet, I suppose," Jack remarked, letting the insult pass. Riggs nodded slowly. "I suppose, well, you seem to have things under control. Just be careful out here. Storm's supposed to last another day at least. And this land, it's got a history. Best not to go digging around in it." The veiled threat was unmistakable. "I'll keep that in mind, Sheriff," Jack replied. "Thanks for checking in." Riggs gave a curt nod and let himself out. Jack bolted the door behind him and watched through the window as the SUV's taillights vanished into the white maelstrom. The sheriff hadn't come to check on him. He had come to evaluate him, to ascertain if he posed a threat. A sudden, urgent premonition seized Jack. He cast a glance at the flickering flames, then towards his truck, which was barely discernible through the dense snowfall. Acting solely on instinct, he donned his thickest coat and boots and re-entered the storm. The wind assailed him, and the snow had already reached halfway up his shins. He struggled towards the truck, his boots sinking deeply with each stride. He made his way around the vehicle, clearing the thick accumulation of snow from the tires. The front two were unaffected. The rear passenger side tire was also fine. However, upon reaching the rear driver's side tire, he discovered a deep, clean gash lodged within its thick tread. This was no accidental tear from a rock or a puncturing nail. It was a deliberate stab, inflicted with a sharp, slender blade, precisely positioned to cause a slow, irreparable leak. Jack remained frozen, the gale and snow swirling around him, the biting cold unnoticed. The sheriff's visit had been more than just an inspection. It had been a statement. The damaged tire conveyed a message more potent than any spoken word. "You are unwelcome here. You are isolated, and we can reach you at our convenience." This was the initial warning. The quietude within the cabin after Sheriff Riggs's departure felt heavier than the accumulating snow outside. The punctured tire was not merely a warning, it was a declaration. They were aware of his presence and had definitively marked him as an interloper in their concealed world by drawing a line in the snow. Jack understood then that he could no longer afford to be oblivious. He needed to comprehend the very reason for Arthur Miller's demise. Leaving the howling tempest behind, he returned to the warmth of the fireplace. With practiced ease, he dislodged the heavy keystone and descended into the small, frigid cellar. He retrieved the dark green metal box, its solid weight a comforting presence in his hands. Back at the table, he used the crowbar to pry under the box's main latch. With a sharp metallic shriek, the seal broke, and he lifted the lid. The contents were not what he had anticipated. No gold, no cash, no discernible riches, but something far more perilous. The box was meticulously organized, a testament to a precise and methodical mind. At the top lay a sheaf of papers. Jack picked them up. They were official-looking laboratory reports from an independent facility in Bozeman, dated 2008. As he scanned the columns of figures, a chill coursed through him, despite the fire's warmth. The reports indicated alarmingly elevated levels of arsenic, lead, and industrial solvents in a series of water samples. Concealed beneath the reports were dozens of small glass vials, each containing a dark, oily liquid and sealed with a wax stopper. A small handwritten label adhered to each bore a date and a set of coordinates. Alongside these were small canvas bags filled with soil samples, similarly labeled in neat script. At the very bottom of the box lay a large, rolled-up topographical map of the county. Jack spread it across the table, its edges curling in the dry air. Throughout the map, Miller had circled specific locations in red ink. These were not arbitrary choices. They followed a distinct pattern, clustering around secluded creeks, high mountain springs, and marshlands, the very sources feeding the entire valley's water supply. These locations corresponded to the labels on the vials. It presented a comprehensive and damning record of systematic contamination. Arthur Miller had not merely discovered a single illegal dumping site, he had uncovered a network of pollution threatening the entire region. The blizzard raged for another day and a half before finally subsiding. Jack awoke on the third morning to a transformed world, blanketed in a thick, pristine, silent layer of white. The sun, when it finally emerged, cast a brilliant, blinding glare across the snow. He spent the morning excavating his truck and meticulously repairing the tire. The task was arduous and cold, but the physical exertion sharpened his focus. He was no longer merely a man seeking solitude. He was the guardian of a grave truth. Ghost remained close, a gray wolf in a world of white, never relaxing, instead taking up a vigilant post on the porch, his gaze constantly sweeping the silent, snow-laden woods that surrounded them. It was mid-afternoon when a new sound shattered the profound quiet. It was not the laborious whine of the sheriff's SUV, but the deep, powerful roar of a high-performance engine. Moments later, a vehicle materialized, parting the deep snow with effortless arrogance. It was a massive, brand-new pickup truck, its black paint gleaming against the snow. It stopped beside Jack's own mud-splattered vehicle, a stark contrast between opulence and simple utility. The man who exited the driver's seat was tall and impeccably dressed in an expensive winter jacket and pristine, high-end boots. He appeared to be in his late 50s, with distinguished silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His hands, soft and uncalloused, suggested a man who delegated tasks, and his face bore the easy, self-assured smile of someone for whom the world presented no challenges. This was Silas Blackwood. He carried himself with an air of ownership, as if the land and all upon it already belonged to him. Quote, Blackwood stated, his voice smooth and pleasant. Quote, Ghost, positioned at the top of the porch steps, emitted a low, guttural growl. Quote, 2. Jack said calmly, making no move to restrain the dog. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and faced the man. Quote, 3. Blackwood's smile did not falter, but his eyes, the color of cold steel, were assessing. Straight to business. I appreciate that. I'll be direct as well. I wish to purchase this property from you. My company, GeoCorp, has been acquiring land in this valley for a new development project, and this parcel is a crucial element. It's not for sale, Jack stated flatly. Blackwood chuckled as if Jack had shared a humorous anecdote. Everything is for sale, Mr. Callahan, at the right price. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 in cash. That's 100 times what you paid for it, a substantial profit for a few days' work. The offer was preposterous, a clear indication of desperation. The answer is no, Jack reiterated. Blackwood's smile finally tightened. The pleasant facade slipped, revealing the predator beneath. Quote, 3. The threat was as clear as the pristine mountain air. Quote, Fauper. Jack replied, his voice quiet yet resolute. Quote, 5. For a prolonged moment, the two men stood in silence. The only sound was the gentle dripping of melting snow from the cabin roof. The confrontation had become official. The lines had been drawn. Blackwood's face contorted into an expression of cold fury. You will regret this, he stated, his voice a low hiss. He turned without another word, re-entered his imposing truck, and sped away, leaving deep, angry tracks in the snow. A few miles down the track, well out of sight of the cabin, Silas Blackwood pulled his truck to a halt. He retrieved a satellite phone and dialed a number. He knows, Blackwood stated, foregoing any greeting. I don't know how, but he knows something is here. No, he rejected the offer. Yes, certainly, I was unequivocal. He listened for a moment, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. His voice rose with frustration. Look, I informed you that we underestimated the bureaucracy. 15 years of maintaining that place discreetly, and it all unravels due to a damn tax notice none of us noticed. I warned you this could occur. Now I must resolve this predicament. I will manage it. Just be prepared. He ended the call, slamming the phone onto the passenger seat. For the first time in a very long time, Silas Blackwood was not in control, and he decidedly did not appreciate it. Chapter 6. When Shadows Move. Silas Blackwood's departure marked not an end, but a new beginning. Jack sensed it in the prickle of unease that settled between his shoulder blades. in the heightened vigilance Ghost displayed, his senses constantly scanning the perimeter. The temporary respite afforded by the blizzard had concluded. Now, the true contest commenced. Jack spent the subsequent days in a state of heightened alertness, a condition familiar from his years in uniform. He repaired his tire, ensuring his truck was prepared. However, he knew departing was not an option. Not yet. He had to honor Arthur Miller's sacrifice. He spent hours meticulously poring over the remaining journals, piecing together the full extent of GeoCorp's operations, the names of local officials involved, and the chilling scope of the environmental degradation. He began making copies of the most incriminating documents, placing them in waterproof containers, preparing for the eventual day he could disseminate them. Ghost was his shadow, his silent protector. The dog's demeanor served as a constant gauge of their security. When Jack patrolled the property lines, assessing the storm's damage and gathering firewood, Ghost would lead, his nose to the ground, his ears swiveling, deciphering the subtle signs of the wilderness. Any deviation from his relaxed gait, any sudden stiffening, and Jack would instantly become vigilant, scanning the tree line, listening for incongruous sounds. The initial incident occurred on a crisp, clear afternoon. Jack was splitting logs near the cabin, the rhythmic impact of the axe against wood creating a hypnotic rhythm. Ghost, who typically remained close by, had instead gone to the edge of the clearing. His body was low to the ground, his gray and silver fur almost perfectly camouflaged against the snow-dusted underbrush. He was completely motionless, a hunter caught in a mid-stalk pose, his eyes locked onto a distant spot within the dense pine forest. Jack paused, his axe held aloft. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, knowing Ghost wouldn't respond with words. The dog didn't budge. He simply stared, his tail a rigid rudder. Jack followed his gaze, seeing nothing but the endless green of the pines and the white blanket of snow. However, he trusted Ghost. He slipped back into the cabin, retrieved his binoculars, and returned, pressing himself against the rough logs of the porch. He found Ghost, still unwavering in his intense focus, and scanned the identical area. It took him several minutes, his eyes stinging from the effort, before he detected it. A subtle glint, a fleeting flash of something metallic deep within the tree line's shadows, too consistent to be natural. A lens, followed by a darker form that rapidly vanished behind the thick trunk of a fir. Someone was out there observing. Jack resumed his woodcutting, maintaining a deliberately unhurried, casual rhythm. He worked for another hour, all the while acutely aware of the unseen eyes in the woods. Ghost remained on alert until the daylight began to wane, only then returning to Jack's side, a low, contented growl rumbling in his chest. The observer, for the time being, had withdrawn. The next significant development occurred 3 nights later. The cabin was illuminated by the subdued glow of a single lantern. Jack was bent over the table, sorting through Miller's research notes, while Ghost dozed fitfully by the fire, his ears occasionally flicking at the sound of the wind. Suddenly, Ghost was on his feet, his fur bristling, a fierce guttural bark erupting from his throat. He bounded towards the door, scratching it frantically, his powerful frame trembling with aggressive intent. "Whoa! Ghost! What is it?" Jack was already in motion, his hand instinctively reaching for the old hunting rifle propped against the wall. Another sound, more distinct this time, a clear scraping and groaning from the front of the cabin, near the door. Definitely not the wind. It was the sound of someone attempting to force the lock. Jack moved with the quiet, efficient precision of a trained soldier. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into near-complete darkness, with only the faint illumination of the dying embers in the fireplace breaking the gloom. Ghost, a dark, swift shadow, took up a position in the far corner of the room by the single window, ready to confront any interloper. The scraping ceased. A moment of unnerving silence followed, then a faint click. The old padlock, which Jack had painstakingly installed only days prior, had been expertly picked. The front door creaked open by a mere sliver, allowing a sliver of darkness, even deeper than the cabin's interior, to seep in. Jack stood immobile, rifle raised, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He could discern the faint, labored breathing of the intruder, muffled by the wind but audible to his experienced ears. He perceived a shape, a tall silhouette, pause on the threshold, clearly hesitant, sensing the unexpected quiet. Then, a low, menacing growl filled the air, originating from Ghost's corner. It was not a bark, but a deep, resonant warning that conveyed raw, untamed power. The silhouette flinched. Jack seized the opportunity. He had no intention of ending anyone's life, not yet. He simply needed to convey a message. He aimed carefully, not at the figure itself, but at the doorframe immediately beside it. The rifle discharged with a deafening crack, an explosive sound in the confined space of the cabin. A splintering noise followed as the bullet embedded itself in the wood. The muzzle flash momentarily illuminated the terrified face of a man, lean and wiry, wearing a dark ski mask pulled up to reveal his shocked eyes. He stumbled backward, startled by the shot, his gloved hand fumbling for something at his belt. Ghost, sensing the retreat, launched himself from the corner with astonishing agility, a gray blur in the darkness. He didn't attempt to bite, but slammed his powerful body into the intruder's legs, a practice maneuver designed to destabilize and disorient. The man cried out, losing his balance, and stumbled backward onto the porch. Before he could regain his composure, Jack let out a guttural roar, a battle cry honed in distant lands. He charged towards the door, rifle held ready. The intruder, caught between a growling, formidable dog and a charging, yelling man, opted for caution over defiance. He scrambled off the porch and disappeared into the swirling darkness of the blizzard, his panicked footsteps faintly crunching on the snow. Jack stopped at the threshold, surveying the night. Nothing. He waited, listening, but only the howl of the wind responded. Ghost returned to his side, his breathing short and excited, his tail now wagging tentatively. "Good boy, Ghost?" "Very good boy," Jack murmured, stroking the dog behind his ears. Ghost leaned into the touch, his body trembling with the residual effects of adrenaline. Jack carefully resecured the door, reinforcing it with a sturdy chair wedged under the handle. He relit the lantern, its warm glow a stark contrast to the recent outburst of violence. He understood this was not an isolated event. The intruder had not been a random opportunistic trespasser. He had been dispatched. The ease with which the lock had been bypassed, the deliberate approach, these were indicators of professionalism, of a coordinated threat. He glanced at the scattered notes belonging to Arthur Miller, then at the sturdy metal box, now once again concealed beneath the hearthstone. They were after what was inside that box, and they would spare no effort to obtain it. He had sent his message. He would not be an easy target, but he also knew that their subsequent action would be far more aggressive. Time was rapidly dwindling. He needed to get these documents into the correct hands and do so swiftly. The aftermath of the attempted intrusion left no room for doubt. The night's silence was a precarious thing, and Jack knew it would be broken again, this time with greater force, greater finality. He was no longer merely a landowner safeguarding his property. He was a witness, and they would not cease their efforts until he was silenced. Awaiting their return was not a strategy. It was a death sentence. He needed to get the story out. He needed an ally. In the cold hours before dawn, as the first hint of gray light kissed the snow-covered terrain, a name solidified in his thoughts: Mark Jensen. They had served together in the same Ranger battalion, two young men navigating the dust and chaos of regions half a world away. Following their military service, Jack had sought solitude, while Mark had pursued a different kind of battle, exchanging his rifle for a pen. He was now a respected investigative journalist based in Denver, known for his persistence and his unwillingness to yield to powerful entities. If there was a single individual on Earth Jack could entrust with this matter, it was Mark. Preparation was a quiet, systematic ritual. He packed a small, durable bag with essential items: a water bottle, a high-energy bar, a first aid kit, and a small pouch for Ghost. Most significantly, he placed a carefully selected compilation of Arthur Miller's evidence within a waterproof sleeve, including copies of the most incriminating laboratory reports, the topographical map, and several pages from the journals detailing the campaign of harassment. The original evidence was returned to the cellar, the heavy keystone sealed back into its position. The secret would remain here, but its repercussions would travel outward. Before departing, he checked the weather forecast on a small hand-crank radio. The announcer's tone was grim. Another, more potent storm system was approaching from the north, predicted to impact the mountains by nightfall and bring with it heavy snowfall and gale-force winds. The encroaching blizzard represented both a risk and an advantage. It would provide concealment, but it also imposed a deadline. He did not head towards the familiar small town. That would be the first location they investigated. Instead, he turned his truck eastward, driving away from his property, deeper into the remote backcountry. This was a tactic from a previous phase of his life, a routine employed to ensure he was not being followed. He drove for an hour along winding, deserted roads, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. He took a turn onto a gravel logging road that led to nowhere, drove for a few miles, then pulled over, feigning an engine check, while discreetly observing the road behind him. Nothing. He retraced his route, then executed a series of seemingly random turns before finally heading south towards the interstate. Only when he was absolutely convinced he was not being pursued did he drive towards the city of Kalispell, a larger, more anonymous town over an hour away. Ghost seemed to comprehend the seriousness of their undertaking. He sat silently in the passenger seat, his usual curiosity replaced by a quiet, watchful alertness, his gaze mirroring Jack's in the mirror. In Kalispell, Jack was a phantom. He parked the truck in a public lot several blocks from the town center. His initial stop was a large electronics store. He paid cash for an inexpensive prepaid mobile phone, the kind typically found in sealed plastic packaging, leaving no tangible record of the transaction. His next destination was the public library. The library was warm and quiet, a sanctuary of organized knowledge that felt like an entirely different realm. He located an unoccupied computer terminal in a secluded corner. Utilizing a public network offered a vital degree of anonymity. He logged into an encrypted email service he had maintained for years, specifically for such an emergency. With swift, practiced movements, he used the library's scanner to digitize the documents he had brought. He compressed the files, encrypted them with a password that he and Mark had established years prior, and attached them to a new email. The recipient was Mark's secure private account. He initiated the send command, observed the progress bar fill, and then logged out, meticulously clearing the computer's browsing history. The entire procedure took less than 15 minutes. The seeds of Arthur Miller's truth were now sown beyond the confines of the isolated cabin. He departed the library and ventured into a frigid, narrow alleyway nestled between two brick structures. The wind whistled around him. He activated the new phone, its electronic chirp sounding disproportionately loud. He input Mark's number from memory. It rang twice before being answered. Jensen. The voice on the other end was sharp, curt, and immediately recognizable. "Mark, this is Jack." A brief silence ensued. Then Mark's tone altered, a note of apprehension slicing through his professional demeanor. "Jack, it's been a considerable time. Where are you? This is not your usual number, it's a temporary one." "I have limited time," Jack stated, his voice hushed. "I've uncovered something significant out here in Montana. It involves Geoc and a journalist who vanished approximately 15 years ago. I've forwarded the preliminary evidence to your secure inbox. The password is the name of the mountain we were pinned down on back in 2003. He discerned the faint sound of typing from the other end. "Got it. I can see the file. Jack, what sort of predicament have you gotten yourself into?" "The kind that necessitates professionals arriving at your doorstep in the dead of night," Jack responded grimly. "Listen, this is the reason for my call. Another severe storm is approaching. It's projected to reach my location by tonight, and it will be intense. I'm returning there now. I must be present to safeguard the original evidence." He provided Mark with the precise GPS coordinates of the cabin. "Here's the arrangement. Should you not receive communication from me on this specific phone by 600 tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Mountain Time, you are to assume the worst. You will take everything I've sent you and any additional information you can retrieve and deliver it to the FBI. Not the state police, not the local sheriff, but the federal agents. Present them with the files and furnish them with these coordinates. Instruct them to arrive in force. Do you comprehend?" The line was silent for a moment, the weight of the directives hanging in the air. Mark was not a man prone to panic. He processed, analyzed, and acted. "Understood, Jack. 0600. If I don't hear from you, I'll initiate significant action. Is there anything further?" "No, that is all." "All right," Mark affirmed, his voice steady. The tone of a soldier and a friend. "Be cautious, Jack." "Always," Jack replied, and terminated the call. He removed the battery from the burner phone and disposed of the two components in separate receptacles. His objective was accomplished. The contingency was established. A burden was lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the cold, clear focus of a man advancing toward a confrontation. He returned to the truck where Ghost awaited placidly. Together, they departed the city, heading back towards the mountains, towards the secluded cabin, and towards the dark, menacing clouds of the impending storm. The journey back to the cabin was a race against the approaching darkness and the ferocity of the gathering storm. The sky, which had only been ominously overcast earlier, now resembled a colossal bruise, swollen and purplish, bearing down upon the rugged peaks of the Rockies. Snow began to fall in earnest, just as Jack's truck rumbled back onto his property. It was heavier than before. Large, wet flakes adhered to the windshield wipers with a speed that outpaced their clearing capability. By the time he arrived at the cabin, the world was already becoming indistinct. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing through the pines, and visibility diminished with each passing minute. He had barely enough time to secure a tarp over his truck and retrieve the last few items from the bed before the storm truly unleashed its fury. Within the cabin, the logs groaned and shuddered under the force of the gale. The fire Jack had started earlier was struggling, the chimney acting as a wind tunnel, yet it emanated sufficient warmth to ward off the bitter cold seeping through the cracks. Ghost, sensing the alteration in the weather and the atmosphere, moved with a quiet intensity. His ears constantly swiveled, capturing the subtle variations in the storm's roar. He did not appear anxious as he had when the hidden cellar was discovered, but rather intensely focused, akin to a hunter preparing for a challenging night. Jack fortified the cabin to the best of his ability. He braced the windows with substantial planks, wedged a sturdy piece of firewood beneath the door handle, and even moved the heavy wooden table closer to the door, placing the 2 chairs atop it, thereby constructing a makeshift barricade. He inspected his rifle, loading it with precision, its familiar weight a somber comfort in his hands. He arranged his sparse provisions: a thermos of hot coffee, a flashlight, and a small bag of dried meat for himself and Ghost. He understood what was imminent. Blackwood and his associates would have received the report that Jack had made contact, that the evidence had been dispatched. For them, this marked the point of no return. The blizzard, while a natural occurrence, also represented their opportune moment. It would trap Jack, isolate him from any potential escape or immediate assistance. It would provide perfect cover for their final, desperate action. They could not permit the evidence, nor Jack himself, to survive until morning. The cabin transformed from a simple dwelling into a stronghold. Jack moved within it with understated efficiency, a product of years spent in combat zones, his senses heightened. Every creak of the logs, every subtle shift in the wind's pitch was scrutinized. Ghost, his silver-gray coat blending eerily with the shadows cast by the fire, mirrored his intensity. He moved silently, his steps light, examining each window, sniffing at the door, establishing his own perimeter. Hours elapsed. The blizzard reached its apex, an unimaginable tempest of wind and snow that shook the very foundations of the cabin. The world outside was an impenetrable wall of white, a raging, howling void. Jack sat by the fire, his rifle resting across his lap. Ghost lay curled tightly at his feet, though not truly asleep. They were waiting. It was just past midnight when Ghost rose silently, without a sound. His head snapped towards the rear of the cabin, away from the door Jack had barricaded. A low, barely perceptible growl began to vibrate in his chest, a sound of deep, primal warning. His fur bristled, and his eyes, amber in the firelight, gleamed with fierce intensity. Jack felt a cold dread slither down his spine. The rear of the cabin featured a single small window, positioned high, overlooking a dense thicket of spruce trees. It was the most vulnerable point, the one he had considered least likely to be targeted, given the sheer depth of the snow and the dense foliage. Quote, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. Ghost moved with a predator's stealth, pressing himself against the far wall, then pivoting slowly, his nose raised, sniffing the air with urgent concentration. He stopped at the back window, his attention fixed. Jack retrieved his flashlight, activated it, then immediately deactivated it, plunging the room back into darkness. The brief flash was sufficient. He saw it, not through the window, but emanating from it, a faint, almost imperceptible gleam of a light source, briefly visible, then gone. It was a careful, controlled beam scanning, not the random light of an explorer. This was a professional. They were not approaching through the door. They were coming from the concealed side, the woods choked with deep snow. They had learned from their initial attempt. Jack pulled the heavy sleeping bag from the floor and quickly repositioned the wooden table, using it as a shield to block the window. He needed to gain time. He grabbed a roll of duct tape and a thick woolen blanket, taping the blanket over the window, sealing out any internal light and obscuring any external movement. Ghost continued to emit a low, rumbling growl, a steady thrum of warning that vibrated through the floorboards. The dog was acutely aware of the unseen presences moving through the blizzard-swept forest. Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude for his companion. Without Ghost, he would have been caught entirely unawares. A new sound began to filter through the roar of the wind, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. It was a rhythmic crunching sound, heavy and methodical, like footsteps pushing through deep, unbroken snow. It was not a single set of footsteps. There were several. They were approaching. Jack moved to the center of the room, assuming a defensive stance behind the sturdy wooden table. He held his rifle at the ready, the cold metal of familiar weight in his hands. Ghost, his gaze fixed on the improvised barricade at the back window, positioned himself slightly in front of Jack, a living shield of fur and muscle. He was prepared to confront whatever emerged from the white, howling chaos. The air within the cabin grew thick with anticipation, a heavy mixture of fear and adrenaline. The confrontation had found them. The siege had commenced. Jack looked down at Ghost, whose silver-gray fur was now almost imperceptible in the dim light, a phantom against the backdrop of the blizzard. He placed a hand on the dog's firm shoulder, a silent pledge. They would face this together. The night was a symphony of violence orchestrated by the howling wind. Inside the cabin, Jack and Ghost moved as a single entity, a seamless fusion of human strategy and animal instinct. The initial assault had come from the front, a brutal attempt to breach the door. Jack, anticipating this, had utilized the back window as misdirection, tossing a log against the wall to draw their attention before firing a single calculated shot from the doorway, incapacitating the first man, who rushed in and sending him screaming back into the snow. Following that, the attackers displayed greater cunning. The engagement devolved into a test of endurance. A trial of nerves played out in the swirling darkness of the blizzard. They probed his defenses. A shot fired through one window, a shadow flitting past another. However, they underestimated his partner. Ghost served as his early warning system, a living radar impervious to the storm's white noise. A low growl directed towards the west wall would signal to Jack the direction of the next impending threat. A soft, anxious whine would draw his attention to the east. Their communication transcended spoken words, a language forged in the shared perils of their ordeal, a silent ballet of survival. Time flowed and blurred. The hearth's fire dwindled to a bed of glowing embers, plunging the room into a deep, ominous shadow. Jack meticulously managed his ammunition, discharging his weapon only when unavoidable, ensuring each shot had its purpose. He remained in perpetual motion, a phantom within his own dwelling, denying them a fixed target. Weariness settled in, the familiar ache of old wounds resurfacing in the prevailing chill. Yet, his intellect remained sharp, honed to an acute degree by the surge of adrenaline and the absolute imperative to remain alive until the morning's 6th hour. A period of quiet descended around 4 a.m. The storm's intensity had somewhat abated, and the tentative assaults had ended. This was a calculated maneuver designed to lull the defender into a misplaced sense of security before a final offensive. Jack recognized the tactic, yet the silence felt profoundly unsettling. He maintained his focus on the cabin's front, the origin point of the initial attack, his gaze sweeping the vicinity through a narrow aperture in the makeshift barricade. It was during this concentrated moment of vigilance that the true danger emerged. One of the assailants, moving with the stealth of a predatory feline, had stealthily maneuvered to the rear. He had painstakingly worked to dislodge the boards covering a small window, managing to pry one loose without generating any sound. Now, he began to slither through the opening, a dark silhouette detaching itself from the deeper blackness outside. He landed softly on the floor, a pistol held at the ready in his gloved hand. Jack's back was to him, but he had not escaped notice. Ghost, who had been resting silently near the hearth, reacted with explosive swiftness. He had been meticulously tracking the man's scent, his approach, every faint sound that had managed to penetrate the storm's clamor. Before the intruder could so much as aim his weapon, Before Jack could even register the new presence in the room, Ghost launched himself across the floor. It was not an outburst of barks and snapping jaws. He was a concentrated force of intent. He slammed his considerable weight, 90 pounds of muscle and bone, into the back of the man's legs, a maneuver calculated to disrupt his balance. The attacker cried out in surprise as his footing gave way. He stumbled forward, arms flailing, and it was then that Ghost struck with precision. He evaded the man's desperate movements and clamped his powerful jaws onto the attacker's right forearm, the one gripping the pistol. The sound was a sickening crunch of thick winter fabric yielding to bone and flesh. The man shrieked, a high-pitched sound of intense agony, his fingers spasming open, the gun clattering uselessly onto the floorboards. Ghost did not rend or shake. He maintained his grip, his entire body taut, pinning the man's arm to the ground, effectively disarming and incapacitating him. Jack whirled around, his rifle snapping up, the scene unfolding before him in a terrifying instant. He kicked the fallen pistol away and hauled the screaming man towards the room's center, Ghost releasing his hold only on command. "How many more?" Jack demanded, his voice a low growl that echoed his canine companions. The man, clutching his mangled arm, could only whimper in response. Suddenly a new voice, amplified and distorted by the wind, bellowed from the darkness beyond. It was a voice Jack recognized, raw with fury and frustration. It was Silas Blackwood. "Enough of this. We're running out of time. If we can't get it, no one will. Burn it. Burn it all down." The desperate command irrevocably altered the nature of the engagement. A moment later, the main window shattered and a torrent of clear liquid followed. The pungent, oily scent of lantern oil instantly saturated the cabin. Jack scrambled back, dragging the injured man with him as another splash breached the broken opening. He had mere seconds. Before any plan could even form, a flickering object sailed through the window, a torch fashioned from a branch bound with a burning rag. It landed in the puddle of accelerant. The world erupted in a whoosh of orange flame. The cabin's ancient dry timbers, seasoned by a century of Montana winters, ignited with terrifying rapidity. A wall of heat and fire roared to life, consuming furniture, air, and everything in its path. Dense black smoke billowed towards the ceiling, making breathing impossible. The option to remain inside was eliminated, leading to certain fiery death. Quote, Jack yelled over the inferno's roar. The dog was already at his side, his eyes wide, his body pressed loyally against Jack's leg. The heat was unbearable, the smoke a suffocating poison. Jack kicked the injured man towards the flames. Quote, 1. He shouted into the chaos. Then, with his rifle in one hand and his other gripping the thick fur on Ghost's back, he turned towards the front door. It represented their sole avenue of escape. He took one last desperate inhalation of the rapidly diminishing air. All strategies and defenses were now irrelevant. Only the fire at their backs and the enemy's weapons ahead remained. With a final fierce roar, Jack kicked the front door open and plunged into the gray pre-dawn light, into the deep snow, and into the crucible of his final, most desperate trial. Jack and Ghost burst from the cabin into a world painted in the hues of gray dawn and fiery orange. The inferno raged behind them, a voracious entity consuming the log walls and sending a column of thick black smoke spiraling into the snow-laden sky. Before them, silhouetted against the blazing structure, stood Silas Blackwood and his two remaining men, their faces taut with grim resolve, their weapons aimed, forming a deadly arc. The air was a stark juxtaposition of piercing cold and searing heat. Ghost did not hesitate. He anchored his paws firmly in the snow, positioning himself protectively before Jack, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest. He was a shield of silver-gray fur, a living testament to loyalty, prepared to confront the ultimate threat. Blackwood's face contorted with pure fury, his once handsome features warped by rage and the flickering firelight. The composed, controlled demeanor of the previous day had vanished, replaced by the primal desperation of a cornered predator. "You should have accepted the money, Callahan," he screamed above the flames' roar. Quote 3. He raised his pistol, its dark metal aimed directly at Jack's chest. The moment seemed to stretch into an infinite pause. This was the culmination, the end of the line. Jack tightened his grip on his rifle, steeling himself to take at least one of them with him. It was then that a new sound pierced the cacophony. It was neither the crackle of fire nor the howl of the wind, but a rhythmic, percussive thrumming that intensified with each passing second. A vibration felt not just in the air, but deep within Jack's chest. All eyes turned upward. Emerging through the low-hanging gray clouds and swirling snow were two distinct shapes. The first was a smaller, agile helicopter, bearing the prominent insignia of the Montana State Police. The second, larger and darker, was a sleek, powerful machine devoid of official markings, unmistakably a federal aircraft. A voice, amplified and impossibly loud, boomed from above, seeming to emanate from the heavens themselves. "This is the FBI. Drop your weapons, place your hands in the air. You are surrounded." Blackwood froze, his pistol still pointed at Jack. His face, a mask of disbelief, rapidly transmuted into the cold, stark horror of a man whose world had just irrevocably collapsed. His two hired enforcers, men motivated by financial gain rather than allegiance, instantly grasped the changed reality. With visible disdain, they dropped their rifles into the snow and raised their hands. The game was over. Blackwood remained immobile for a moment longer, a defiant statue against the backdrop of the burning cabin. Then, with a final guttural cry of pure rage, he threw his pistol down and raised his hands in surrender. The ensuing hour was a flurry of organized professional activity. Agents clad in tactical gear rappelled from the larger helicopter, while state troopers secured the perimeter. The two injured men Jack had subdued were located, received medical attention, and subsequently taken into custody. The conspiracy, tenaciously maintained for 15 years through intimidation and authority, had unraveled in mere minutes. A tall, composed man in an FBI jacket approached Jack as the fire department, having finally forged a pathway, commenced their efforts to contain the remaining blaze. "Agent Thompson," he stated, extending a hand, "you must be Mr. Callahan. Your associate in Denver, Mark Jensen, was remarkably persuasive." "It was 6 miles," Jack replied. The profound exhaustion finally asserted itself, weakening his legs. "That was the deadline. He contacted us precisely at 6 goals," Thompson confirmed. He related a narrative so detailed that it could only be the truth. Now, regarding the evidence Mr. Jensen mentioned, Blackwood appears to believe it was lost in the fire. Jack surveyed the smoldering, charred remnants of his temporary home. A faint smile touched his lips for the first time in days. "Blackwood was always one step behind," he remarked, gesturing towards the intact stone chimney, which now stood like a solitary tombstone. "The real evidence is beneath the hearth. It's secure." Weeks later, the melting snow yielded to a warmer spring sun, revealing the initial signs of verdant growth on the forest floor. The yellow crime scene tape had been removed. The burned-out shell of the cabin remained, a stark scar upon the landscape. But the air had been cleansed. The events had become a national news sensation. Armed with Arthur Miller's painstaking research, the FBI had systematically dismantled the entire GeoCorp conspiracy. Sheriff Riggs, along with a dozen county officials, was apprehended. Silas Blackwood, facing a formidable array of charges, began to cooperate, implicating the individual at the apex of the operation, Senator Peter Coleman. The indictments were sealed, and the ensuing legal proceedings, as Jack anticipated, would be lengthy and challenging. Mark Jensen's rental car navigated the now cleared trail. He emerged appearing more aged than Jack recalled, visibly fatigued, yet the same sharp, intelligent spark remained in his gaze. Quote, Mark remarked as they both surveyed the devastation. Quote, 1. Jack responded softly. Quote, Ghost, who had been resting at Jack's feet, lifted his head and nudged his hand as though comprehending the commendation. He was unharmed, aside from a few singed patches of fur, his spirit as robust as his owner's. The seller's evidence was the crucial element, Mark continued. It will lead to their prolonged incarceration. More significantly, it will necessitate a comprehensive remediation of this entire valley. You've granted hundreds of families their future back, Jack. Arthur Miller did that, Jack corrected. We merely concluded his endeavor. They remained in comfortable quietude for a period, two seasoned veterans observing a different kind of conflict zone. So, what lies ahead for you now? Mark eventually inquired. You are free to go wherever you please. You could pen a book. They would offer a substantial sum for the rights to this narrative. Jack surveyed his surroundings. He gazed at the expansive silent mountains, at the towering pines murmuring in the gentle air currents, at the pristine, frigid creek meandering along the perimeter of his land. He observed the scorched remnants of the cabin, yet he perceived not a ruin, but a foundation. He saw a place where he had been tested and had not succumbed. He looked down at Ghost, who was regarding him with steadfast amber eyes. The dog was home. And so, Jack realized, was I? I'm remaining, Jack declared, a sense of profound serenity washing over him, an emotion he had pursued for years. I intend to rebuild. He had arrived at this location seeking refuge from the specters of his past. He had encountered peril, intrigue, and a conflict he had not sought. However, amidst it all, standing upon the remnants of what had been, he had also discovered a purpose, a future, and an unbreakable connection with a devoted canine of gray and silver hues. This was no longer merely a tract of land, it was home. Occasionally, the haven we seek is not a geographical point, but rather a bond of unwavering trust. The account of Jack and Ghost serves as a reminder that the most profound fidelity often transpires without spoken words, a silent pledge to confront any adversity together. If their odyssey has resonated with you, then you are a valued member of our narrative-sharing community. Kindly assist us in disseminating these sagas of bravery by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. We would be honored to read your own reflections on loyalty in the comments section below. Your next story awaits your discovery.